Okay, more monohybrid crosses. Monohybrid simply means that we're dealing with one trait at a time when we do these crosses. And they're the simplest crosses. So that's why we're starting with these. Now, when you're doing these crosses, you're going to come across all kinds of traits. And so what I thought I would do is just kind of give you an idea of some of the possible traits that we can have that tend to show up and whether or not they're dominant or recessive. So if we talk first about humans, okay, I'm going to put dominant trait here, and then over here, I'll put the recessive trait. So in humans, for instance, we have something called a widow's peak. I'm going to get a smaller, I'll get blue here, and I'll go thing. So a widow's peak is a dominant trait, W-I-D-O, widow's peak. And what it is it's your hairline at the front of your head. Okay? So a lot of people have a hairline that comes across and makes a little downward V shape, right? If you look around the room, you'll see some people have a hairline that has a slight little V right in the center. Other people have a hairline that's either straight across or doesn't have that V. So the little V, the little downward dip, is called the widow's peak. And it's a dominant trait. The opposite recessive trait would be a straighter hairline across the forehead. So you can notice this on people. An interesting almond-shaped eyes, which is pretty much the normal shape that we consider eyes to be. Almond-shaped. But some people have more rounded eyes, and rounded eyes are a recessive trait. Recessive traits, you would think, would not show up very often in the population because, or would not show up as much because they can only be expressed in very limited situations, right? So typically the dominant peak, or the dominant traits tend to be the ones we see most often. Earlobes, if you look at earlobes, sometimes the earlobes are free sort of hanging, but some people's earlobes, they kind of go right down and attach to the side of the face, so there's no little sort of dangly part. So we call that free earlobes, or attached earlobes. Attached earlobes. That's the recessive version of that trait. Typically, the color brown, when we're talking about eyes, brown is more dominant over, say, blue. But the problem with eyes, I'm going to put a little star here. The problem with eyes is there's more than one gene that controls eye color. When there's more than one gene that controls something, you tend to get a lot more variations. And so eye color is not as simple as being either blue or brown, right? There's hazel eyes, there's green eyes, there's all kinds of different shades in betweens, gray eyes, and so on. So eyes are not really the best trait to do monohybrid crosses with because multiple genes are involved. But typically, we do know that brown eyes tend to be dominant over blue eyes, at least on that particular gene. Likewise, darker hair, brown hair, tends to be dominant over, say, blonde or lighter hair. But again, I'm going to put a star there because there's lots of variations with hair color. Okay? Then there are some certain diseases that are recessive genes. They're genetic diseases. And if you get the recessive gene, you'll carry the disease, but if you have both recessive alleles, you will have the disease. So I'm going to write those down as well. I'll write them in a different color because they're not really traits, they're actually conditions or diseases. One is cystic fibrosis. And these will all be written in the recessive side because you have to have both recessive alleles to actually have these conditions. Another one is something called Tay Sachs Syndrome. Sickle cell anemia. This is where your red blood cells, instead of being round, are kind of crescent moon shaped, or like a sickle, right? And you find this a lot in African populations because it turns out that sickle cell anemia compromises your ability to transport oxygen slightly. But amazingly, it also seems to confer a little bit of resistance against malaria. So while sickle cell anemia is not necessarily a good thing, if you live in a place where there's lots of malaria, it actually does turn out to be beneficial. So we tend to see more of the sickle cell anemia things in people who live in areas where malaria is more prevalent. Africa, parts of the Mediterranean, and that kind of thing. Incidentally, freckles, which is not a disease at all. Freckles is more of a trait, so maybe I'll put that one in blue. Freckles, I don't know why I had this one on the end. I guess I was looking some up and I just found that one. So freckles. Now we can also look at some other animals, not just humans. So for instance, I was just looking up a few examples. If you're talking about dogs, again, we'll continue with the dominant recessive here. In dogs, dark fur is usually dominant over more yellow or blondish fur. So if you think about certain dog breeds, like, Irish setters and things that sometimes come in that nice blonde, or labs even, the blonde colored labs, that's a recessive trait. I gotta get this here. An even coat of fur is dominant over spotted. I should say white spots, not colored spots. Let me erase that. Colored spots are sometimes white spots. Colored spots are sometimes the result of what we call codominance, and we'll talk about that later. If we go to cats, again, black fur is dominant over white or brown fur. And short hair in cats is dominant over long hair. Short hair, that says short, or fur, is dominant over long-haired cats. So those are just some interesting ones, and these are the ones that come up a lot when you're doing questions and problems. You don't have to memorize these. I just put them here to give you some idea. Every question we deal with will identify, right? Oh, and I guess we should also point out in the pea plants, Mendel's pea plants, right? We had yellow was dominant over green for color, and we found that round was dominant over a wrinkled. We haven't really talked about that much, but that'll come up too later. Wrinkled pea. Okay, so those are some examples of dominant and recessive traits. Thank you. Okay, let's do an example then of some crosses, and we'll just kind of get into the habit of seeing how they work. So let's call this examples. How's that? The last section was pea plants. Okay. We'll also do some crosses with different colored flowers. Sometimes certain colors are more dominant than others. Red is sometimes dominant over white, but not always. There's all kinds of issues, and we'll get to all the details later. All right. So you may see a situation like this. Let's do a simple one. A homozygous recessive a homozygous recessive dog has blonde fur. A heterozygous dog has dark fur. Determine the genotypic and Whoops. And phenotypic ratios for a cross between these dogs. They were to mate. Okay, so when we read the question, homozygous means it has to have the same two alleles. Well, let's decide on our alleles. We're talking about an allele for dark hair versus not so dark or blondish fur. So we need a letter for this. Now, when you look at this, homozygous recessive for blonde fur means that that's two of the small letters, right? So the gene is dominant, it seems, for dark hair because the heterozygous dog, who has one of each, turns out dark, which means the dark hair allele must be dominating the other one, right? Remember, heterozygous means he has two different alleles. So that means we're going to use let's use a capital D for dark hair, and a small d then would be the recessive condition of the blonde hair. So we're going to choose our alleles. D is the dark-haired allele that's dominant, dark-haired dog, and little d will be the blonde-haired dog. Remember, we have to use the same letter. We can't use a B, a little b for blonde, and a capital D for dark. It's got to be the same letter because we're talking about the same gene and the two different alleles. So that's going to be how we do it. So let's look at our two individuals. We have one that's homozygous recessive. Recessive is small d, and homozygous means it's the same. So it has to have this genotype. This is one parent. Okay, this is the parent. Doesn't matter if it's the male or the female. There's the parent. The other parent that we're crossing with this with, so we put cross with, is heterozygous, it says in the question, which means it has two different alleles. So it has to have the big D and the little d, like that. So we can tell from the question what the genotypes are of these two individuals. So this is the other parent. And these are their genotypes. That's the cross we want to do. So what we do is we figure out the possible gametes that can be contributed by each parent. If these parents were to undergo meiosis and produce sperms and eggs, their homologous pairs would separate, and these alleles would go individually into the sperms and eggs. It's pretty obvious that for the gametes, this parent can only produce a small d. There's no other option. No matter what sperm or egg it makes, it's going to get one or the other. But the parent over here can produce both a capital D or a small d, depending on which way they split. So some of its sperm or eggs will have big Ds, and some of them will have small ds, right? Some will carry the recessive allele. Now, this step you can do in your head, obviously, when this is, because you can just look at it and say, well, there's one there and there's two there. But I'm doing it like this so everybody follows along. Once we know the gametes, we can draw our Punnett square. So we draw our Punnett square. Let me use a thicker line here. Actually, let's go even thicker. Nice thick line right down the middle like this. And another one over here. Now I'll go back to my thin line. And so what we have is for one parent, we only have one possible gamete, the small d, right? So that comes from here, right there. The other parent has these two possible gametes. So those two possible gametes will go here. One is a capital D and one is a small d. And I'll put a cross between them. There's no need for a cross the other way because there's only one option. Nice and simple. And then so what happens is when we cross them, we get the following results. The capital D from the top goes with the small d. So when we cross them, what we're doing is we're imagining what happens when this particular sperm right here meets this particular egg. They fertilize and they produce this combination, right? Kind of remember the physical, remember what's going on physiologically inside the cell, as well as just doing the squares. Don't just write a bunch of squares and put a bunch of numbers. Think in your head what's happening. The other situation is maybe this particular sperm cell isn't the one that made it to the egg. Maybe it's this one. So if that one makes it to the egg cell, you'd get this cross, the small d and the small d. So these are the only two possible combinations that you could get, right? And so what we would say is for the genotypic ratios, the two possible genotypes, for the ratio, we want to say, well, there's this one. Let me just include that there. The genotypic ratio is 1 out of 2. There's two possibilities in the square, and there's one of them, which is 1 out of 2, which is the same as 50%. So we usually write it as a percent. 50% this genotype, heterozygous, and the other one is 1 out of 2, 1 out of 2, or 50% homozygous recessive. Those are the genotypic ratios, 50-50. In other words, if you're going to have a baby, if these two dogs are going to breed, the chance of getting this genotype is about 50%. And the chance of getting this genotype is 50%. There's no way to know which one you'll actually get. And that doesn't mean that if you have two babies, one has to be one and one has to be the other. Every single baby is a separate event that has a 50-50 chance of being dark or blonde, okay? So it doesn't matter how many blonde babies you've had already, the next one that you have still has a 50-50 chance of being blonde or dark. And that, of course, is the phenotypic ratio. So if we write the phenotypic ratio, now we're talking about what do they look like. The phenotypic ratio is this. Double DDD means that will be a dark-haired dog because the dominant gene here is going to mask the other. And so it's 50% for a dark-haired dog, and it would be then the other combination, which is the small d's, that's blonde hair. It's the only way you can get the blonde dog, and that would be 50% as well. So there we've done the genotypic ratios, which are the ratios for each combination of allele, and the phenotypes, which are the ratios of the colors. In this case, they matched 50-50, but they don't always match. They're not always the same. Let's do another cross and see what happens. We okay? Can I go ahead, or did you need to copy that? Second example. A male cat is heterozygous for short hair. I should say is heterozygous with short hair. Well, actually, for short hair, and I'm going to say that that's the dominant condition, short hair. I'll just remind you, because we're not going to memorize all the different possibilities. A female is homozygous. No, let's go heterozygous again, just to make it interesting. Eraser. A female is also heterozygous for this trait. What is the chance, or the probability, what is the probability of getting a long-haired cat from this cross? So we're a cat breeder. We're going to have these two cats, we're going to breed them, and we want to know what's the probability of getting a long-haired cat out of this. Okay? So, again, what we do is we determine the allele letters that we're going to use. We're talking about short hair. Now, here's the problem. S is not a very good letter because a big S and a little s are very easily confused if your writing is sloppy. So I'm going to choose a different letter. I'm going to choose a letter that has more distinction between the capital and the small so that I don't make it too bad. We're talking about hair, so how about a capital H for hair, right? So that means that capital H is the dominant condition, which will stand for short hair, because we said that short hair was dominant in cats, right? Short hair. That means a small h will stand for long hair. So as I said before, it doesn't matter what letter you choose, as long as you choose one and be consistent, right? So those will be the letters we use for our alleles. So it's a good idea when you're doing these questions, especially if you're handing in an assignment or something, to identify your alleles like this, just so I'm clear what you're writing for each allele. Okay? It's a good idea to do that. Most of the times you can figure it out by looking at it, but it's still a good idea to be clear and concise. Okay. Now it says they're both heterozygous in the question, which means they both have two different alleles. So both parents, in this case, have the same genotype. Both parents are heterozygous. So that means both parents, what do they have, long or short hair? They both have short hair because they both carry the dominant allele, capital H. But they also carry the long hair allele. So it's possible that when they have babies, there might be a combination where those long hair alleles could get together and produce long-haired babies. Okay, so the possible gametes then for both parents are, right? Both parents can produce either so both parents are the same, and they would produce either an H capital, they would pass over the dominant allele from, remember, here we are, metaphase 1, the homologous chromosomes are separating, so the capital H goes one way, the small h goes another, and so it's possible to get both of those different alleles in the gamete. And then we do the cross. So in this case, for our cross, we have a nice chart here. Our gametes for one parent are either a capital H or a small h, so we'll put a line down between them. And the other parent is also a capital H or a small h, so we'll put a line down there and we'll cross this way. So now we can see we're going to have 4 possible outcomes, right? And we cross them. So when we cross them, we get, in the first square, a big H crossed with a big H. So the two sperm, the sperm and the egg, are getting together, and one sperm carried the dominant allele, the other sperm, or the other egg, carried the dominant allele, and there's the fertilized condition. Over here, we get this situation. Down here, we get this situation. And then lastly, we get this situation through small alleles. So we can see that there is a chance that we will get a long-haired cat because that possibility does show up. Okay. Now, we could figure out the genotype ratios if we want. The question didn't ask that, but if we figure out the genotype ratio, let's just do that as kind of review, right? This is not really answering the question. You don't need to do this, but it's good practice. So the genotypes are HH, that's one possibility. The other possibility is HH. Now it happens twice, but it's the same possibility, so you don't write it twice. And then the third possibility is HH. Those are the 3 possible outcomes, right? And so this one is 1 out of 4 possible outcomes, or 25%. But this one happens twice, so it's 2 out of 4. And this one happens once. So the ratios are 25% chance of getting that, but there's a 50% chance of getting this, and a 25% chance of getting that. So that's how you would have done the genotype ratios for this question. And then if you wanted to do the phenotype ratios, just to review, you could look at the different possible phenotypes. So short hair or long hair. Well, HH and HH both produce short hair, don't they? So that means out of the 4 possible outcomes, 3/4 of them have those short hair phenotypes. And only one, the little h, produces the long hair phenotype. So there's only 1 out of 4. So you see how the phenotype ratios are different than the genotype ratios, because both of these genotypes express as the same phenotype, short hair, because of that dominant gene. Okay? We call this person or this cat the carrier. It carries the recessive allele but doesn't show it. So you can't really tell by looking at it. The only way you could tell is by doing breeding experiments and keeping track of the offspring and trying to figure out what genotype it may have had. But this question specifically said, what is the chance of getting, I'll go back to that, what is the chance of getting a long-haired cat? Well, we don't really need to do all the ratios to answer that question. We can simply look and say, here's the long-haired cat. So we count how many times that occurs, and it only occurs once in all of our chances. So for HH, there's only 1 out of the 4 possible outcomes, so there is simply a 25% chance of getting a short-haired cat. Or, sorry, long-haired cat, a long-haired cat. Okay. But again, we did all this. We did the stuff over here just to kind of review how it works. And of course, we see the answer to the question is obviously right here. There's the genotype, right? 25%. But we really, if you're looking for a long-haired cat, you wouldn't look at the genotype. You'd look at the phenotype ratio, because you're not asking what are the chances of getting a homozygous recessive cat, although it's the same thing. But you're asking for chances for long hair. What are the chances then of getting a short-haired cat? Well, you wouldn't look up here. Sorry, you wouldn't look at these, because you'd have to, they're both short hair. You'd have to look at this ratio, which is 3/4, right? 75% chance of getting a short-haired cat. So it's pretty straightforward. What you have to also remember, though, is that these are percentages. This does not mean that if you have 4 cats, that's exactly what you're going to get. It means that every time a single cat is conceived, its chances of being long or short hair can be determined by these ratios, right? It's still possible for this cat to have 4 babies and all of them have long hair, because it just happened to be this one 4 times, or maybe this one and this one. This combination over here just never actually made it in that particular meiosis, right? In that particular fertilization. So this does not tell you exactly what the offspring will be. It tells you only the probabilities or chances for each individual offspring. In fact, it's possible for these 2 cats to have 3 cat kittens, and they all 3 could have long hair. 3 out of 3. Because each time they just got the 25% option, right? So that's possible. Now, what we usually do is we can't tell if, the cat has 3 kittens. But if you have a plant that's had 270 offspring, then what happens is when you start counting, the numbers of offspring in that very large sample tend to reflect the percentages much more closely. In other words, the more kids you have, the closer you will come to these ratios. Okay? All right. Good. I think we'll call that quits then. That's about 30 minutes. So that's the monohybrid cross.